Hi all, I have another absolutely fascinating Magnus Carlsen game to show you. This is from the Grenke Chess Classic. In round 8, Magnus was black against Peter Svidler. So we see e4 from Peter Svidler, and Magnus plays the Sicilian defense, knight f3 and knight c6, which is often the sign of the Sicilian Sveshnikov. So this aligns quite well to the video yesterday of my own over the board game. So do we see a mainline Sicilian Sveshnikov? No. In fact, Peter Svidler plays knight c3. And there's actually a psychology he mentioned behind this, that he felt he was blundering a bit too much and wanted a solid position to start off with and then play it from there. So that's interesting how grandmasters can sense their strengths and weaknesses during a tournament, adapt their opening to suit that preference. So he didn't want such a sharp struggle here, more strategic in nature. And in fact, Magnus kind of obliges here with e5 as well. This looks more strategic in nature than, say, e6, which is the most common move, just trying to potentially transpose back. But I doubt this would have been played d4. I think something else would have been played here, not transposing back into a sharper Sicilian. However, with e5, the tone is set for the d5 struggle. This is a key central square which white ideally would like to torture black with, and we see bishop c4, bishop e7, very careful move order, because knight f6, white can actually pounce with knight g5 on that f7 soft spot. So here, for example, this is pretty much a disaster after d6 taking. This is horrible for black. So bishop e7, being careful about the f7 soft spots and things like knight g5, d3, d6. Now knight d2, this is very, very interesting indeed. If white had just castled here, then the problem, the downside, the subtle little downside, is that the f1 square, the rook has taken that parking space and would have to move. If white ever wants to get a strategic knight maneuver to that central d5 square, the Steinitz way is accelerated without castling first, and that's what is the kind of Steinitzian method is being used here to accelerate the use of f1. So we see knight d2 immediately, not the routine castling move. Knight f6, knight f1. So is this overly sophisticated, or does it actually have a practical nature to it, just saving a whole move, having to move the rook later if white did routinely castle? We see knight fd7, which is very interesting as well. Sometimes dynamically, so black's not even casting immediately, but by getting the knight out of the way of the f-pawn and trying to parry that bishop, maybe later black can put the king on h8 and use the f-pawn. We see knight d5, knight b6, offering a concession potentially, which is taken up. Knight takes, a takes, not queen takes, because then there's another tempo gain after knight e3 for knight d5 hitting the queen. This position, white has a small edge. So Magnus plays to inject dynamic play by a takes b, so activating the rook. So sometimes that might be significant. We see c3. Black now castles, knight e3. And now bishop g5, wanting the exchange potentially of dark square bishops. White castles. King h8 was played here. Now an important stem game in this position, instead of king h8, which is pretty ambitious to play for f5, unpin the f7 pawn and then play for f5. It looks like a really aggressive idea. In this position, bishop takes e3 has been played by Vladimir Kramnik against Peter Leko in the Dortmund tournament of 2003, and that game kind of just had simplification, not too much tension after, and in fact they agreed a draw here, so not too much of a major fight there. So that's a stem game around here. So king h8, so Magnus is looking to play aggressively here. a3. An alternative here for another interesting stem game was bishop d2. In fact, Vichy Anand had chosen bishop d2, against Vasily Ivanchuk in the Moscow tournament of 2001. Now, Vasily Ivanchuk with the black pieces did actually take on e3 and did play quite aggressively, as we see in this example. He played eventually for f5 eventually after taking on d5. He did go for it with f5, and he got actually a very good attack going, and did this, with ideas of queen d7 and knight h4. So this is really quite dangerous, or queen c8 and knight h4. Now this rook lifting over to hit h3 as well. Actually, that's more important than the knight h4 idea. And he actually managed to get from this position a good ending. That knight was better than the bishop in this ending. And he actually won here in move 42. So yeah, these two stem games. So one is a bit tension reduction, simplification, draw, and the other is a big fight. So anyway, Magnus is more of a big fight here with king h8. We see a3, f5. So interestingly, not minding giving up a bishop for a knight. So that's an interesting dynamic decision as well as the other one, accepting double pawns. Knight takes f5, so we do have an exchange of dark square bishops, so at least white doesn't have the bishop here. The other aspect of this, black's central pawn mobility is being enhanced, of course, with the immediate d5. The grip on d5 has been loosened, but is that pawn a target later on d5? We see the bishop going back to a2. There's a very interesting nuanced idea that was discussed in the post-mortem, which never really occurred to me at all, that bishop b3, and the significance of this is that sometimes white might want to somehow reroute and kind of fianchetto like this to point at d5. So that would give, maybe it would lend more king safety to white's king, as well as hit d5, and there's no pawns protecting d5, so there is a little bit of a sensitive square for black. So that's very interesting to consider bishop b3 as well as bishop a2. So we have here rook takes f5, queen g4, and now rook f6. It's a bit weakening to consider g6 in theory, but it's possible that, for example, f4, it's possible black has good resources here, like knight e5 taking here. And there's a fascinating line here with knight takes d3, as if black's asking for it because of queen e3. And look at the bishop and queen on the light and dark squares. It turns out tactically black can survive this with king f8. It seems that white, with best play, white is busted here with best play. So that's kind of interesting as well. Anyway, the weakening move is not needed. Rook f6. We see f4. Now this does destabilize white's position and weakens e3, which is easy to say, of course, but what if, for example, rook c e1, not touching the f pawn? It would seem as though black has a very comfortable position here. For example, if white goes into kind of tortoise mode with f3, okay, there's an issue with h2, g3 putting up the shields of the shell, the tortoise shell, and say after a4. Black does have a small edge, but this tortoise could be a difficult one to crack the shell of. It does seem as though white, could be solid here. But with f4, white's solidity is traded off a little bit. To try and really, it seems, to get at d5 in a tactical manner. So this bishop without the counterpart, you'd think this is really quite dangerous here, as well as this diagonal if it ever fianchetted, which it can't now. But the idea of this is to really hit d5 now with queen g5. So hitting d5 and encouraging light square weaknesses. We see, though, a surprising reply to this whole idea. So a creative idea, but a very creative reply. On queen, if rook takes f4 instead, then there's knight e5, And this is just a tactical disaster because black hasn't weakened the diagonal at all. This is just clearly just forking and winning in exchange for nothing. So queen g5 is the point to hit d5, but queen f8 is very interesting. Now one of the things with d4 weakening the light squares is actually white could employ a gambit here, for example like this, where it looks as though isn't d3 hanging, but this activates the bishop, and with black having these weakened light squares, this is actually technically an even position. Queen e2 might be the absolute best move here. So for example like this would be about even. Now there are dangers there which are quite interesting to actually mention as well. Just to give credit to the whole concept in this position of this gambit idea of Peter's Vidler. If say queen d7, then the battery queen e4 and picking up this pawn, this is actually a big advantage for white. Or even worse in this variation, on 26, on rook f1, this is another idea. Say knight e7, then queen d6. Yeah, sorry, we saw this, but say there wasn't knight e7. Can you see what white is threatening here? If rook d8, what does white play in this position? If I give you 5 seconds to pause the video. Okay, there's actually queen f8 check, so that celebrates the bishop, cutting the escape squares, check, mate. So yeah, there are some fun lines here, but Magnus cold showered the whole stuff, whole concept with queen f8. Is actually celebrating the slight downside of having, for white, a pawn on f4 means a marker pen for e3 to hold potentially this knight, believe it or not. So bypassing improving the quality of the bishop and instead trying to focus on improving the quality of this knight, having a nice central knight, octopus style, in all directions, hitting in all directions is preferable. We have queen takes d5. So on bishop takes d5, that's not possible. Rook f5 forks queen and bishop. So that's just winning a piece in broad daylight. So queen takes d5. Now rook d8. We have queen f3. Now here, it seems as though queen f3 might be a slight inaccuracy. Maybe queen g5 is possible. So for example, rook f5, and yeah, it seems technically this is almost imbalanced. If queen h5, this position, black is doing it well, a pawn up. This is a solid pawn up. This should be absolutely great for black. But yeah, there does seem to be, an improvement with queen g5 in particular. So queen f3 though was played, and we have knight e5 offering b7. So this is a very powerful gambit idea, positional gambit, to entrench a central knight plus form pawn benefits. If a form pawn can come to f3, this will be super dangerous. Not just the central knight, but the form pawn could be devastating for white's king safety. We see queen e4 here. On queen takes b7, the form pawn immediately with f3 is dangerous. For example, like this, knight takes h2 is remarkably destructive. So for example, rook takes here, and now check picks up the rook on c1. So this is really dangerous. If g3, leaving that dreaded form pawn. See, by the way, the description for Teespring if you want to pick up a form pawn t-shirt. The form pawn is deadly here after knight takes d3, c4 to get in on this diagonal with queen c5 check. For example, this would win a piece. So what does this entrenched knight now supported? What does white do if h3, then rook e8, and it gets super nasty now, as you might expect. This kind of thing, hitting g3, hitting h3, knight f4 is a tactical crushing move. So it all goes very much downhill if queen takes b7 on f3. So the queen stuck around queen e4. We are hitting the knight immediately, so no time for f3. So the knight entrenches itself on e3. And this is, yeah, it looks like another Magnus game recently where he had an octopus knight hitting in all directions. This is just really a great situation to be in, this huge knight on e3. So we have rook e8 offering b7, so destabilizing white further. Now for g5, believe it or not, super aggressive stuff from black. Absolutely super aggressive dynamic play with threats of g4, g3 and queen h6. For example, rook f2, fe2, g4, and white's just not got any constructive plan here. Petrosian plays rook f2. If bishop d5, which might have been one of the intentions, this just fails tactically. The knight hitting on d5 means rook b8 is actually winning that bishop. Yeah, there's no mercy there. So rook f2, we see queen h6. Black's just building up for g3 here. Queen c7 trying to put a break on g3. But now rook e f8. It turns out, from an engine perspective, g3 is possible after hg, not to play f takes here for queen takes g3, but instead this, and it turns out this position is devastating for white. This particular position is devastating because, for example, rook takes, there's knight g4, and whatever white does, white's busted. For example, like this is checkmate. So yeah, this is a fascinating position tactically here. If we look at this again, instead of rook takes g4, if bishop e6, check, check, taking check, yeah, it's all check. So we see queen c7, rook e f8, simpler than g3 though, still with g3. No need to be that clever. So, and now Petrosian kind of makes an aesthetic end to this game by playing h3, g takes, and now g3. So he's done this before to get a really nice finish recorded when he's about to lose. He loses. He likes losing in style. So we see f takes g3. If there was g takes h3, then the rook g6 check, and then queen takes, and then queen f3 is going to be mating. So g3 here, and now f takes. So that hits that rook as well. There's no real time for anything like queen takes g3. So rook takes, check, and now g2 check mate. So what do we learn from this game and the two key stem games that I mentioned? What do we learn generally about this? I thought there's a very nice positional struggle around the d5 square. There are interesting opportunities for the bishop, in theory, to sometimes maybe even fianchetto in the variations. But during the game, it seems this interesting pawn sack kind of backfired on white. White could have set up a tortoise shell and maybe held out for a draw, but instead, Petrosian, to his credit, tried to play a very creative idea with the pawn sacrifice and liberate the bishop. Magnus was not allowing this bishop to be liberated. He wanted it in a way to centralize his knight, which is the knight's form of liberation if you think about it, because knights in the center are more liberated than at the corners of the chessboard. So Magnus was essentially liberating his knight rather than the opponent's bishop. That was the basic fundamentals, I believe, of the discussion. Once we had a central entrenched octopus knight, we also, for black, from black, the black perspective, had pawn mobility, extremely dangerous form pawns around the king emerging with mobility, which were unstoppable. So a pretty sharp, sudden end to the game at move 33. So very, very exciting stuff. If you enjoyed this game, then please click on the top left box, which should appear shortly. Become a member at chessworld.net, play against other YouTubers. You can also test yourself on the variations covered in this and other games from the improved menu at chessworld.net, the puzzle books option, which has a link to the annotated game. And I'll bolt on a little bit from that after this video. So comments, questions, donations, see the description. Like, share, subscribe with the notification bell. Really appreciated. Thanks very much. Okay, this is the puzzle book for this game, so all the interesting key variations. I'm looking at clear advantage or mates between 1 and 10 moves. So for white or black. So here, black to play for a clear advantage. In this position, I seem to remember that, knight e5 has that forking idea. So, yep, that's clear cut for black to get a big advantage. Let's have a look at another. White to play for a clear advantage. I think queen e4 here, threatening mate and taking here. That was one of the major ideas behind that queen g5 stuff. Here actually I've kind of forgotten what did I mention there? Just centralizing the queen. Okay, just centralizing the queen. That takes a lot of key squares. Here black's forking with rook f5. I think just taking out that bishop. Here black to play for a clear advantage. Actually, was it g6 here? Is g6 possible here? Nope. Hence, rook takes d3. And g6. And then... I've actually forgotten. What's the idea? King g7. That takes some key squares away, improving black's king safety. Okay. Black to play for a clear advantage here. Form pawn's really dangerous. I think... Does black just crash through? What was this again? Knight takes d3. And then maybe c4 is possible for queen c5 check. So some tactical ideas there once that form pawn's established. I think black can win that bishop here with rook b8 and just take that bishop. That octopus knight is being celebrated there. I think here black can just crash through with the form pawn attack because there's f2 on the cards. f2 is crushing. That's absolutely crushing. And one last one on this particular set of filters. I think here we can play the check to win that bishop with check, basically. Okay, yeah, check out the puzzle book on the improved menu at Chessbowl, and you'll see the game from yesterday. No, not 2 days ago, Carlsen against Aronian as well. I should really put my over the board game. That had quite a few variations. Also, if you want to check out Magnus Carlsen puzzles, there's a book of 271 throughout his career on that, starting from way back in back in the 90s. So yes, check out the puzzle books on chessbowl.net. Thanks very much.